So the fire strategy is a design document. It's what we'd do for a new build if we were designing from scratch. The retrospective version is what we might try to put in place as best we can for an existing building where we haven't got some information. What it is specifically is relative to building regulations as opposed to the fire safety order. So it covers the same stuff in terms of fire safety generally, but with a slight different focus. But what the building regulations do is line up more readily with the building safety case. So the HSE are telling us, which I've already alluded to, I think, that the fire strategy is something that sits to the side, if you like, of the fire risk assessment. It's something slightly different than the fire risk assessment, and they've listed it there as a separate entity for the reasons that I've already discussed. But if we look at the shaded box at the bottom, it says, for example, if you consider fire doors, you need to know how those fire doors contribute to the fire strategy of the building. This will help you understand why doors with those ratings were chosen in the first place. And this understanding will also help in producing the safety case report. How we sit in with those pieces of guidance, how comfortable we are with them, how the building aligns up to that, identifying any areas that we might need to look at, and then providing a report with those recommendations. Typically, we slide those in the front, do a sort of benchmarking exercise, just to say where you need to make improvements, and perhaps some of those are quite high priority. What we need to do to bring it to a standard that sits then with the fire strategy that we will have done retrospectively, that sits behind those recommendations in that report. So what you will have is a report that covers principally B1 through to B5 of the present version of ADB, and benchmarks to those, and justifies any deviations on a risk-based level, or it might examine and tease out some of the engineering methodology that might have been applied.
And I think this is where it ensures you have a good quality full fire risk assessment, which is providing the detail and insight, which really the regulator is going to be looking for. And to see that organisations like yourselves have taken that further step, taking those further steps where they're needed while undertaking that intrusive surveying. As you all know, we're dealing with high risk blocks at this stage. As you can see, from April 2023, the registration for existing occupied high-rise residential buildings will be open. And then in October, this is the deadline for existing occupied buildings. And at that point is when all your buildings across your portfolios, where the building is over 18 metres, would now be registered prior to being occupied. That's also for new build projects, so within the development teams as well. Then the building inspector and building control approver registers open, and this is where the building safety regulator becomes a new building control authority for high-rise residential buildings. And then in April 2024, this is at this point where the regulator will start to call buildings for assessments, and then at that point issuing the building assessment certificates. And this would also involve the requirements relating to registration for building inspectors and building control approvers becomes enforceable from this point onwards. I think it's just a summary of those points, fully understanding what information is required as supporting evidence if this has not been done already. Undertaking that gap analysis really is important to get started as soon as possible. Also, again, I do appreciate this probably depends on the quantity of buildings you have which fall within scope and how much resource internally is actually being given to spend time on this. And also then the next point, completing the relevant surveys and then data collecting to fill the gaps by appointing relevant and experienced consultants. And then lastly, not focusing on just high rise. So anything we're doing with regards to, this is a message we always discuss with a lot of housing providers and local authorities, is, as we know, there is a clause in the Building Safety Act which states that there is it's a question of, not just a question of if, but it's a question of when. It will include, where this will include the buildings which are 11 metres plus or even lower of different risks. So it's not just focusing on high rise. So currently, yes, that is the priority, is what the regulator is requiring, but it's ensuring that the processes we put in place are possible and achievable across a much larger proportion of your portfolio.
In essence, what makes a safety case. The way we've approached it is clearly having a defined system. What's in our safety case and what's outside it. So you've got to, set some boundaries about what you actually are going to look at, which bits of information are important, and then go forward to that analysis of the risks and controls in place. And then in that, deciding which risks and controls are the one that are most prominent and most important to focus on and understand. And then, of course, you need a framework for the management of all those activities related to those risks and controls and all the other sorts of supporting activities. And this can go right across the organisation. So, my view, we've created what we call a building safety readiness plan, listing all the things that need to be done and who in our organisation may need to lead on it. And it goes right across, of course, the obvious ones in our compliance teams and our maintenance teams, but also into our legal team, people dealing with the leasehold arrangements, because there's so many changes and we need to bring this all along together as a whole organisation. And you have to bear in mind, this may seem new to us. It is new to us. It's also new to the HSE. They haven't worked with our sector in this way ever before. They've been on a learning journey as well, perhaps even steeper than ours, to understand our sector, and I think they're doing remarkably well. I've certainly noticed in our conversations they're constantly taking notes, and I hope they're finding it useful having the dialogue. So yeah, the building safety regulator is keen to engage, certainly with housing providers, and also receive input. We're providing quite a lot of input as a group. The HSE, the BSR, is not expecting all our HRBs to be perfect, but where we have deficiencies, we need to demonstrate that we've got a risk proportionate plan in place. So it's, we're not going to resolve everything overnight. We know, for instance, the external wall cladding issues, they've taken a number of years to resolve. We're going to find other problems in our buildings. We won't be able to do them all at once. Not just because of the financial impact, but just because of the shortage of contractors to deliver the works, or the specialists that we need to do the assessments and design work. I can see that we'll be doing sort of safety improvement works in our buildings as a result of what's happened now for at least the next 10, maybe 15 years. The safety case is about, in a sense, being open about the problems you have in your building, and but showing that you have a way of managing those problems.
Would a type 4, I believe they're referring to FRA there, always be required as part of a safety case?
Yeah, I was looking at those questions, and I suppose the answer is it depends. If you don't know much about your building, if you've got a building that was built in 1967 and you have very little information, you're probably going to have to do quite a lot of intrusive investigation. Now, that goes the same for the external walls as well. It's if you've got a lot of information already, if you've got a recently completed building and surprisingly the health and safety manual, the O&Ms are good, then you may not need to do those investigations, or at the very least they're lighter touch. They're more about verification of the design information you've been given.
Yeah, I think at the moment we are looking at buildings over 18 or 7 stories in terms of the definition, if you like, of high-rise buildings for the safety case. I think that's in the timeline. Again, I think a couple have mentioned, and generally speaking, the applicability is about safety, not whether or not my building falls into a specific criteria. At the moment, there is the clock is ticking, if you like, for buildings that are over 18 metres or have more than 7 stories with two or more residents in them. I think it's the definition.